But I would first like to say thank you, everybody, for your hospitality. I've been made to feel very welcome here, and it's great to see so many people interested in this fascinating subject. We've listened to a wonderful array of papers over the last few days, and I'm particularly pleased because many of them have relevance to some of the points that I'm going to raise later on. So if we just, there we go, kick ourselves off with the PowerPoint. And what I thought I'd talk about today is really three separate themes. To start off with a review of funerary archaeology, where we've come, where we're at, and perhaps more difficult, where I think we're going. The second part is to look at some of these issues that we have tried to talk about, particularly today, of questions of status, social organization, and the difficulties archaeologists have had trying to work out who was who in the past, because of course that simple problem of the dead not burying themselves, and of course the living manipulating the dead. And that brings us into another area of investigation, which is that question of the living dead, where the dead have agency and are active forces in the social, economic, political, symbolic world of the living. And that's going to take me on to an archaeological case study. We heard a fascinating talk from Pascal this morning. Are you here, Pascal? Where is he's somewhere. About mummification in the Marchesa Islands in the Pacific. And for me, I think it raises that fascinating issue for archaeologists. How do we know if previous corpses, skeletal material, how do we know if those were once mummified? And of course, as mummified, as Pascal was explaining, they are actually present in those societies above ground and maybe actually playing a role as agents within those societies. So I'm going to look at some of the ways that we've developed new scientific methods in order to identify former mummification from skeletal material. So let's start off with a review. And I take really the first period from 1970 to 1990. And that this encapsulates the Titan, the great struggle between the processualists and the post-processualists. Normally they're seen as two separate strands, one after the other, but I really want to put them in together because there were shared themes, that the post-processual critique was exactly a critique of some of the new archaeology of the time. And those initial reflections on the concepts of social persona, social status, and using cemeteries and funerary assemblages to infer the social complexity of societies at different levels of organization. And out of the post-processual archaeology, along with it, came a critique of gender, that until that point, women and children were seen as largely irrelevant. What we were after was, in that rather chauvinistic world of the mid-20th century, was that sense that, oh, surely only the men were of importance. And to see, as Roberta Gilchrist put it so well, to see that actually gender was as an important an aspect as social status. I think one of the other important directions that came both within the processual and post-processual fields was an interest in social anthropology. The avid reading of all of the major works, people like Maurice Bloch, Jack Goody, and many, many others, and also an interest in starting our own ethnographic observations, developing an ethnoarchaeology of death. So, of course, that realization that social anthropologists never quite recorded the information that we wanted. Who was buried where, what were their grave goods, what was the style of coffin or whatever it might be. All those micro details that are so crucial to our interest were generally not reported, so it was up to us to go and ask those questions in the field in a variety of societies. And I had great fun looking at my own society, well, at that point was Cambridge in 1980, and discovering that social status was not mirrored in expenditure in funerals. And out of that came a growing interest in looking at the relationships between the living and the dead. And we've heard a lot about that in the last few days, not just in terms of where the living put the dead, both mentally and physically within the world that they inhabit, but also the way that the living have come and always will play, so the dead play a role amongst the living. Now, alongside all these social concerns, there was a rather separate renaissance, and that was in the science of osteoarchaeology, that we could pretty much tear up most of the scientific reports on human skeletal material that were written before 1970. There came a new rigor, a new sense of scientific inquiry, a new methodological soundness that we have benefited from ever since. And as colleagues were discovering in North America and in Australia and in other post-colonial nations, the 1970s and increasingly into the 1980s was a time of deep ethical introspection. Reburial issues became paramount concerns in the USA, in Australia, and numerous other countries. I think the developments that we then saw in the 1990s and up to the present day, I think the great change is the development of a large and impressive suite of scientific techniques. And out of the osteology, we now have a wonderful array of methods. Forensic archaeology as applied to modern day atrocities. So many of my students are working in areas like Bosnia and the Middle East and South America, excavating the remains of people who have been murdered in conflicts just in the last 40 years. The development of an Anthropologie de terrain, we've heard all about Henri's splendid work from his own mouth as well as from others in these last couple of days. We're seeing tremendous developments in ancient DNA. It's been slow to come, but I think we're now beginning to see the results coming through. And one area of work that I've been particularly involved in is the study of isotopes in tooth enamel, in dentine, and in bone for looking at issues of mobility, migration, and diet. Now, what's been happening on the social and theoretical side? And I think we've seen certain of the aspects that came out of the post-processual critique amplified and developed. An interest in memory and materiality, a realization, for example, that the materials that were used to represent the dead, for example, stones and their immortality that goes along with them, that these are an important aspect of the construction of memory. We've also been thinking about the ways that the dead are deliberately forgotten, and we saw some very interesting examples of that on our first day. There's been a long-running interest in ideology and power. Again, the manipulation of the dead, also of bodies and being. There is now an entire archaeology of the body in recent years. And from the work of particularly Christopher Tilley, a phenomenology of landscape and the way that the dead populate that landscape and, of course, are so important to its construction and modification. We've also seen, on the public side of things, the issue with ethics and reburial spread to areas other than those post-colonial nations such as the USA and Australia, so that even within the UK there have been major concerns and debates and conflicts over reburial. And some of you will have followed the reburial of King Richard III, the king found in a car park, and the issue of where was he going to be buried, in Leicester or in York or even in Westminster Abbey. Even the concerns of a long dead king were a matter of public concern. We've also seen an enormous development in televised archaeology. Thousands, well, in fact, millions of people know about archaeology from the television. And of course, the aspects that the public particularly love are skeletons and mummies and pyramids. So there's a sense that we've had to pander to the lowest common denominator with some rather the exciting bits, rather than some of the less terrific discoveries that we make. So where are we going? And these, I think, would be my predictions. I think we're going to see increasing conflict over human remains, as the cultural critic Tiffany Jenkins has pointed out. Calls for reburials by minority groups are a vehicle for broader concerns about archaeology, that as a particular type of funerary practice, and I think we're going to hear more about that in the next paper, we are now just one group of stakeholders amongst many who feel that they have claims on sometimes extremely ancient remains. In our own context in Britain, for example, there are factions within the New Age religious movements of Druids and pagans who consider that all prehistoric bones and skeletons are their ancestors and that they should be reburied. Nobody's interested in the Romans. Maybe you will be. Maybe you can demand their repatriation to Rome. So we've seen, I think, a degree of scholarly introspection into ethics, and there has occasionally been an all too ready willingness to just hand over any sense of responsibility and say, all right then, have the bones back, destroy our database. But I think there's also a growing sense that we do have a say. We are as much stakeholders as anybody else. We are the experts. We're going to see continued interest in theory. The archaeology of the body, I think, has tremendous potential for the future. But one area I think we haven't looked at is the evolution of human consciousness in much detail. We as funerary archaeologists are looking at not simply the record of past funerary practices, but embodied within those, the human attempts to answer that biggest question of all: what happens when we die? And it's what we see in these attempts to deal with death, really, are those human attempts to overcome death, to explain it all in some meaningful structure, to transcend our tragic limitation of mortality. And we have that record of our attempts to answer that question, to deal with mortality in archaeology. We are going to see continuing advances in scientific methods for sure. I'll say a little bit about those later. But of course, certainly in Britain, we are in an age of austerity, of economic downturn. Our recent elections have not given us much faith that we will see further government funding increases and so forth. What it means is we will be forced back on the material that is in curation, increasingly to carry out laboratory analyses, scientific analyses. Anyway, on to issues of status. And of course, today, one can be buried like an Egyptian pharaoh. You can be buried in a gold coffin to the adulation of millions around the world. In the case of the tomb of Michael Jackson, the king of pop, there is a prime example of how status is reflected in death in a way that is archaeologically retrievable. Now, of course, we would acknowledge that he is somebody who has an elite or had an elite status while living. But there are many others who have the simplest of burials. Contrast, oh, hang on, damn it. Contrast that with the burial of King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia earlier this year. The simplest of graves, and yet one of the richest and most powerful men on the planet. Now, we've known for some time that the dead don't bury themselves, and here's that quote. He's been mentioned several times as Edmund Leach. He says, if graves are in any way an index of social status, it is the social status of the funeral organizers as much as the social status of the deceased that is involved. And I was, at the time that he wrote that, slightly later, I was fascinated by some of the results coming out of social anthropology that backed up his view. For example, Peter Metcalf's work amongst the Barawan of Borneo. But taking us back, of course, to that funeral of King Abdullah, one could say, well, it's actually in the tenets of Islam that people should go into death in the simplest of ways. And you could say, well, this has nothing really to do with the politics and the status. This is actually to do with religion. But that argument doesn't entirely hold up. If we look, for example, at the funeral and the monumentalization that followed after the death of the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, we would see, of course, that it was the vehicle for a monumental structure to be built over the grave as a shrine. And of course, we only have to go back a few centuries to the Islamic burial that we call the Taj Mahal, where Shah Jahan and his favorite wife, Mumtaz Mahal, are buried within that extraordinary tomb. And I think this brings me on to one of the key themes that has been floating around for many decades, but I really don't think we've actually taken it as far as we should. And yet it's one that we can go back to 1945 in a paper by Gordon Childe, in which he discussed how certain burials, such as this one, Sutton Hoo, occurred at times of political change, when kin-based societies evolved into class-based states, new rulers asserting their power and authority over the masses. Now, he was putting this in a very overtly Marxist sense, but I think we can see that this is a key concept which comes up time and time again. As colleagues have pointed out, even with something like the royal pyramids of Egypt, we can see this sense of pulsing through time, particular moments when huge, large-scale monumentality helps to actually build the state, beautifully summed up by Peter Metcalf and Richard Huntington in saying that the pharaohs built the pyramids and the pyramids built the pharaohs. This notion of a reflexive relationship with material culture. And in terms of manipulating those dead, we have some splendid examples, whether we wanted to choose communist regimes' use of mummification. Lenin, of course, the most obvious, and quite possibly the decision to mummify him taken because of the recent discovery in 1922 of the tomb of Tutankhamun. But also amongst the fascists. Eva Peron, the wife of Juan Peron, spent, 14 years on the move. So her final resting place was not attained until 1976, long after she died in 1952. Her preserved body not only initially displayed, but traveling to Spain and back to Argentina. So that we've come to understand that burials and funerals should be understood as political events, performances for display, competition and contestation amongst the living. We can see that they're exploited for hegemonic purposes, but it's always possible to undermine and subvert. That, of course, didn't happen. In the case of this particular funeral, it was a hegemonic power play by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. When Paul von Hindenburg, the president of Germany, died in 1934, Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, stage managed and masterminded that funeral. Hindenburg had wanted to be buried in his hometown. The Nazis thought otherwise. They chose the funeral to be held and the place of burial to be in the fortress of Tannenberg in East Prussia. Tannenberg was the site of a famous German victory in the 19th century. It was also associated with the Teutonic Knights, medieval warriors, and of course the Nazi regime wanted to align themselves with both previous social groupings. And I think the most important thing that came out of this was the presidency was abolished. Hitler was able to name himself Führer. No longer was there a president to keep the chancellor in check. And we know what happened thereafter. But let's come back to issues of where the dead have, I think, even more agency, where they are an active force in the affairs of the living. And I think one of the prime areas of interest here is to do with mummification, because mummies are actually the physical reality of the dead in day-to-day communication and practice with the living. And I think one of the most fascinating ethnographic accounts I've ever come across is from post-conquest accounts of the conquistadors in South America, conquest of the Inca Empire. And in particular, it was the power of the royal mummies to give consent to certain activities. And there's this wonderful story of how one of the young relatives of Pizarro fell in love with a local girl and wanted to marry her. Who did he have to go to for permission? The mummy, the royal mummy. How did the royal mummy give permission? Well, fortunately, the mummy had an interpreter. And the interpreter said, yes, the mummy is happy that you marry the girl. But the mummy's dead. How did the mummy do that? And it raises for me a big issue. Maybe we have really seriously underestimated not simply the long-term manipulation of the dead after death. We broadly come from cultures where when you're dead, you go into the ground pretty quickly. But we know from ethnography in many societies that biological death is only the beginning of a very long period of ultimately transformation, in which long periods of time may be spent by the corpse or bits of it amongst the living. And we've known this from medieval reliquaries and so forth for a long time. But it's raised my interest because if we look even at some of the very early burials that have survived from human prehistory, for example, from the Upper Paleolithic, such as Markina Gora, from the Natufian, this one from El Wad, and also from the Epi-Paleolithic, the bottom one. That bottom skeleton was originally a seated burial in a marshy area. And of course, as the body has fallen apart, so the legs have splayed. Well, the question is, are these actually former mummies? Look at the way that some of those are bound so tightly, bodies in seated positions. And how would we ever know? Well, we've had a piece of luck recently from excavations on a very small Scottish island, a place called South Uist. It's just here on the map. And it's where I've been digging on and off now for 30 years. And it has a remarkable landscape. A lot of it is Scottish peatlands and moorlands, so very rocky. It's a windswept and wet environment, not a conducive place to do archaeology. What it also has is a strip of very fertile soil where those acidic peats meet the shell sand, the calcareous shell sand. Oh dear. Press the wrong button. There we go. And we call it maca. Here I've written it out so you can see. And what was interesting about this sand is it's made up of shell, so it preserves bone extremely well. And it was here that we excavated a row of Bronze Age houses from the early part of the late Bronze Age, which continued in use through into the Iron Age. And there's a reconstruction of how they might have looked, these curious round houses built as a terraced row. And under those houses, we found a series of burials. There were cremations, but more particularly, there were inhumations, and in various stages of articulation and disarticulation. The ones I'm going to concentrate, because we don't have much time, are these two, buried under the northern house. This individual, we discovered, was actually 3 individuals. We have the skull and cervical vertebrae of one individual. We have the torso of a second individual, and you can see where the spine does a 90-degree turn because of the join. And then we have a third individual represented solely by the mandible, because that mandible has a full dentition and the upper jaw has lost all of its teeth. Molars, incisors, premolars. So it was possible to interpret this as a fitted together body. Now, we were also getting curious after this discovery to think about why the body was so tightly flexed. Why also were the bones so discolored, so very, very brown, given that bones in this environment are normally absolutely pristine, beautiful white bone. When we turn to look at the other skeleton, which was similarly, well, discolored in that this one was bright orange, we realized that there was something unusual about this individual, because I'll call it for now, because again we discovered this was another composite, was holding its 2 upper lateral incisors, that's these 2, one in each hand, the left in the left hand, the right in the right hand. We also realized that the left knee had been broken off, so the base of the the bottom of the femur, the top of the tibia and the fibula, and still in articulation, had been buried in a pit 5 meters away. More than that, still in articulation, the bones had been broken long after death, because this was an old fracture, not a green fracture, and yet there has to have been soft tissue attaching the bones in articulation. And in fact, the whole, the snapping of the bones has to have happened before the body was put in the ground. We then discovered, through osteology and ancient DNA analysis, that the skull was not the same person as the torso. We also discovered that the arm here belonged to a third person on the basis of ancient DNA. More than that, with the male skull, the radiocarbon date, it is likely at 1 sigma, 68% probability, that the skull is somewhere between 70 and 200 years older than the rest of the skeleton. So that got me interested. I thought, what we need is a method, or a series of methods, a mummy identification kit. And I brought colleagues together, and they put together a suite of methods: histological thin section analysis, mercury intrusion porosimetry, short angle X-ray scattering, and Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. I'm really just going to focus here on the histological thin section because I think it's easiest to explain. What normally happens when a body decays is that the tiny blood vessels in the bone are invaded by bacteria. And what will happen is that this nice clear bone matrix becomes invaded by the bacteria, which leave this very darkened signature. We're looking here at the surface of the bone there, and you can see there's been some invasion, but actually most of the bone is unaffected. And this is because we're seeing the arrest of bacterial decay, that it started, but it is then stopped. The other aspect that was interesting, that was demonstrated by the FTIR analysis, was that the surface of the bone had lost its calcium. It had become demineralized. So these bodies had been in some kind of environment that was not alkaline, like the Marchesa sand, but something more acidic. So we think that it may have, these bodies may have spent some time in a peat bog. And of course, that could well explain why we have such strange discoloration. And it's interesting that it's just slightly earlier than these graves that we have the first evidence for the cutting of peat in the Outer Hebrides. Now, that little analysis we carried out many years ago. It was published in 2005 and 2007. But it made me start to think, have we been missing this practice more widely in other parts of Britain and Europe and the rest of the world? And I looked at some of our burials from the Middle Bronze Age, and I thought, yes, yeah, a number of them are really quite tightly flexed, as if they've been tied or bound. Might some of these be examples? So fortunately, a willing PhD student came along, a young man called Tom Booth, and together with him and my colleague, Professor Andrew Chamberlain, we set him on a mummy identification program to look at burials from all periods of British prehistory and history. What he did was to start developing control samples so that we could compare, for example, those cases where a body has suffered full bacterial attack, as in the normal case when a body is left to putrefy, the one in the middle. We could compare it to an example of fresh human bone, and as you can see, perfect preservation, no decay at all. And then we can also compare that, with a mummified example. And as you can see, near perfect, small pockets of bacterial decay. What Tom found out from his analysis was that there was one period that when you looked at the articulated remains only, putting aside the disarticulated ones, and when you looked at those that had been in aerobic environments as opposed to anaerobic, what he discovered was that it was the Bronze Age within Britain where we find many examples of bone without bacterial attack. And we've been able, of course, to use contextual information to show in cases, for example, like this, that there is discoloration of particularly those parts of the body that where the skin and soft tissue are thin and easily broken through, the cranium, the articular ends of long bones. And in this case, it looks as though this has been exposed to some low-level burning that would be consistent with smoking of the corpse, rather than, for example, the use of peat to tan the body. And we've discovered that this is something which ranges in period from the Bell Beaker, so from around 2400 BC, right through to the end of the Bronze Age, around 800 BC. And we've located now a number of cases within Britain where we believe we have formerly mummified skeletons. And I think this raises the issue of where else? And the time has now come to develop this methodology to examine different parts of the world to see where it holds and where it does not. Just to finish with, I want to introduce you to my mummy, because having moved to UCL in London just 3 years ago, I've got to know one of my colleagues very well. He has been dead for 166 years. He is Jeremy Bentham, one of our founding ancestors, and he lives in a glass-fronted box in the main university building. And you can see from the slightly old photograph of him sitting there, he's still sitting there today, but his head is no longer placed between his legs. He has a waxwork head, which was crafted for him soon after death. But the head itself has been preserved. It was preserved by placing within a vacuum into which sulfuric acid was introduced. The eyes are glass, and when Jeremy Bentham was alive, he had them specially made. And as you can see, they're a startlingly blue color, but he was absolutely precise in getting the color to match. And he carried the eyes around in his pocket in his later years. Now, he was an interesting man, a great philosopher. He was the exponent of a philosophy called utilitarianism. He was fascinated by religion because he saw it as the scourge of humanity. It had to be eradicated. So I think in part his desire for his auto-icon was to combat religion and the power of religion, to say, look, isn't this something we can do without? What he also decreed in his will was something really very interesting. Not only do we have to look after him, and in fact his head is kept in the safe in our Institute of Archaeology. We bring him out twice a year to inspect and to make sure that he's adequately conserved. But he also requested that his body be present at meetings of the University Council. So he may be very old, but he plays an active role. Thank you very much.